In 1922, the Soviet Union was formed, a new nation that would have a profound impact on the entire globe. It would emerge from the remnants of the Russian Empire after a long and bloody civil war.
Russia, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, was a country in absolute turmoil, a brutal and bloody clash of arms trying to wipe out this new regime before it can take control of the country.
The Bolsheviks finally succeeded in about 1922, and then came the hard work of trying to create, for the first time ever, a new socialist country.
From out of nowhere, Vladimir Lenin had become the leader of the largest nation on earth and was now imposing his will.
Lenin won the war. Lenin won the revolution. Lenin's one of those amazing figures who really are decisive in history. One's got to understand that Lenin was an autocratic character who really didn't want anyone to succeed him. That's true of most autocratic characters in history.
But Lenin would have a successor who proved to be the most ruthless of all figures when dealing with both his own people and his foreign enemies.
They realized after the revolution that the Soviet Union was surrounded by enemies. It didn't have a friend in the world. They felt that way, and they were probably right. And the only defense was to build an enormous army with a lot of tanks and a lot of aircraft and a lot of ships, which they did.
In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as a new global superpower that matched the once mighty Russian Empire of old.
All of us who were then young, we were seeing great achievements by the Soviet Union. They launched the Sputnik satellite, fantastic scientific achievement. They put the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, fantastic achievement. And so people were saying they saw the Soviet Union as a genuine, comparable competitor with the United States.
Now, a century from its formation, the Soviet Union seems to define the whole of the 20th century. In October 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was about to be removed from power. Whilst on vacation in Pitsunda on the Black Sea, he grew suspicious of activities developing in Moscow, and he immediately flew back to the capital city. Upon arrival, he was forced to step down as leader of the Soviet Union.
The official Russian announcement said he resigned. The Reds say ill health prompted Khrushchev to step down. Observers say that his abortive feud with Red China that broke apart the front of monolithic communism was the real reason. A man who clawed and fought his way to the top, wooed leaders like Nasser of the neutralist nations. Khrushchev probably made his greatest impact on a strangely fascinated world when he came to the United Nations Assembly in 1960 and attempted to purge Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. He piled shock upon shock when he and the Soviet delegation rudely interrupted speeches by Western delegates.
The Soviet leadership overthrew Khrushchev. They called him in and they denounced him and they sacked him from all his positions. And the reason they did it was because of his kind of arrogance, his despotism, his completely ill-thought-out adventure.
What sealed Khrushchev's fate was his interference with agriculture and his harebrained scheme to imitate the Americans by growing lots of maize, and in order to do that, wrecking existing crops. So there was serious food shortages in the shops and serious discontent. That was more important to the party than anything else. There had already been a number of riots by workers who were dissatisfied, and that was the decision to get rid of him.
forces began to conspire against him, and leading those forces was Leonid Brezhnev, who sees that maybe now is the moment to act, that maybe this is the moment where he can get his hands on the levers of power.
The crowds that once cheered Khrushchev wildly were left in the dark as to just what went on when the Central Committee met to act on his retirement and to name Leonid Brezhnev as the new leader of the party, while Alexei Kosygin took the job of premier. Brezhnev has lately been considered Khrushchev's heir apparent, but the question remains as to whether he had anything to do with hurrying his boss's departure.
Khrushchev is on holiday, he's summoned back to Moscow, and the Politburo, led by Brezhnev, denounce Khrushchev. They criticize him for everything he's done, and they say they want him to step down from power. This will not be a coup quite as brutally as Stalin might have done it. He's allowed to resign, but it is the end of Khrushchev's reign of power. Now, Leonid Brezhnev is the man at the helm.
You know, they voted him out, they didn't execute him, they didn't imprison him, they just retired him. In the meeting, he said, you know, whatever else happens, my one achievement has been that no one's going to be shot now. I'm just going to retire. And so it happened. And Brezhnev became the next leader.
Brezhnev was a pair of safe hands, a man with a good military record. He just wanted to keep the apparatus going as it had in the past, to appoint suitable first secretaries and heads of Soviets and so on, and who allowed a fair amount of corruption. His own family was horrifically corrupt. His daughter Galina was a nightmare. But that corruption was a sort of lubrication for the party. And under Brezhnev, everything had a price.
Brezhnev is known among Western diplomats as the red in the gray flannel suit, a man who is expected to continue peaceful coexistence with the West while trying to heal the breach with China. It had been indicated that Brezhnev would be Khrushchev's successor on his death, but no specter of death or disgrace marred the scene of Khrushchev's 70th birthday party last spring. He seemed to have the world, the communist sphere, at his feet, and his power over 220 million Soviet citizens seemed impregnable. Now, for better or worse, the Khrushchev era has come to a close.
Well, Brezhnev was a generation younger than Khrushchev. And he had been a real beneficiary of Soviet higher education, of Soviet social mobility. So born in a working-class family, he got a degree in engineering and became a practicing engineer in the 1930s, joined the Communist Party, served in the military as a party official. So he had some practical knowledge of the economy, and he wasn't ideological the way the early Bolsheviks had been. The party the Soviet Union was the only thing that he knew. So he had worked his way up into the party. You can see his face in the great kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon. Brezhnev is standing there just behind Khrushchev. So he was a trusty aide at the time, and so was one of the leaders at the time of Khrushchev's dismissal, along with Alexei Kosygin. The two of them came to power together. Brezhnev soon eclipsed Kosygin, but initially it was a dual leadership.
And he was a bluff, good-natured, pleasure-loving, quite capable apparatchik who'd been chosen by Stalin and promoted, who'd played a part in the arrest of Beria and served Khrushchev quite loyally until the end. But it gradually became a stagnant period for the Soviet Union. No reforms were really succeeded, and the Soviet Union needed reform.
Unlike Khrushchev, who'd attempted to decentralize the economy, to give more power to the regions, Brezhnev wanted to do exactly the opposite. He was much more in the mold of Stalin. He wanted to bring everything back to the center, to bring power back to Moscow and to bring power back to himself. One can see at this point the Soviet Union is reverting much more to the model that had been created by Joseph Stalin.
The reign of Brezhnev is seen to be, one historian has called it, that he made a little deal with the Soviet people, that he promised them economic prosperity, which included, because the communist economy was so inefficient, it included increasing tolerance for a shadow economy, for some black marketing, some private enterprise. The government turned a blind eye to that in exchange for political loyalty. And most of the people made this bargain and agreed not to be in opposition to the government.
What Brezhnev wanted to achieve was a parity in terms of weapons between the Soviet Union and America. And he begins injecting vast sums of money into military expenditure. At one point, some 12% of GDP is being spent on the missile program inside the Soviet Union. Remarkably, he does achieve parity. By the 70s, the Soviet Union has an equivalent number of warheads to the United States.
The world thinks that it's business as usual and it's just a change of leader. In the eyes of the world, the Cold War continued unchanged. But what we could not see then, but we can see now, is that all this time, the enormous strain upon the Soviet economy of maintaining this empire and the stupendous armed forces at colossal cost, that all the time the Soviet Union is creaking and cracking under these enormous strains.
Since 1954, every American president has offered support to the people of South Vietnam. We have helped to build and we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise.
In 1965, President Lyndon Baines Johnson followed up on his promise and ordered US troops to intervene directly in Vietnam. One of the great proxy battles of the Cold War had begun.
The Vietnam War affected the Soviet Union more in the sense of the Soviet Union's relations with China than just with the United States. So the Vietnam War was kind of a triangular communist enterprise between China, the North Vietnamese, and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union really didn't want the North Vietnamese to invade the South because that was going to destabilize the region, but they felt it was the Chinese who were urging them on. So initially, the Soviet Union was not vocally opposed to the invasion of Vietnam and the war in Vietnam, but once it happened, they were certainly willing to use the propaganda points of an imperialist war being waged by the United States in Vietnam.
With the Vietnam War, all he had to do was supply missiles and laugh as the Americans lost it, because he knew perfectly well that there was no way in which you could win a war when you're supporting a corrupt regime in the South, and you had a dedicated regime in the North, which had armaments from the Soviet Union, armaments from China, and didn't care how many people it lost.
Vietnam was a strange phenomenon because, America poured in forces in there and was never actually defeated, but it lost the will to win, which is always decisive in a war. Partly it was a Vietnamese nationalistic uprising against foreign control that had started against the French and it continued against the Americans and their regime in the South. Partly it was a proxy war between the superpowers. American troops were there. Russian advisors armed the Vietnamese in massive quantities. But the Vietnamese were thought by the Americans to be completely under Soviet control. But in fact, they fought the war they wanted to fight and were quite recalcitrant in taking orders from the Kremlin. But it was America's first great humiliation.
But just as America was becoming embroiled in Vietnam, the Soviet Union was facing its own battle in Europe. In the 1950s, uprisings had been crushed in Poland and Hungary, but a new crisis was emerging in Czechoslovakia under the rule of Alexander Dubček. The Prague Spring had begun.
The Prague Spring was an attempt in Czechoslovakia by Czechoslovak communist leaders to find a different path towards communism. They called it socialism with a human face. And in fact, all the East European countries were somewhat different from one another and not all following in lockstep to the party line. So certain deviations were allowed, but Brezhnev felt that there was a danger to socialism itself by these reforms in Czechoslovakia. And so he invoked what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, that any threat to socialist power in one socialist country should be combated by all of them. Another version of the Brezhnev Doctrine is what we have, we hold. And so rather than let the reformed communists succeed in Czechoslovakia, he created the pretense to send Warsaw Pact troops into the country to put down this reform.
Russia's purpose in continuing to keep such large, powerful and mobile forces in Czechoslovakia has been in effect to put a pistol to Mr. Dubček's head. There is plenty of evidence that for his own part, Mr. Dubček intends to go on resisting the pressures and is prepared if necessary to get his head shot off. But there is now a question mark over the continuing loyalty of enough members of Czechoslovakia's Communist Party's Presidium to give Mr. Dubček the support he needs to say no to the Russians or the demands they will make when the talks begin.
The Prague Spring, this uprising in Prague against Soviet rule, is a real challenge for Brezhnev. How on earth is he going to deal with this? His initial response is to try and do a deal with Alexander Dubček, but it quickly becomes apparent that this is impossible. And under pressure from the Politburo, he decides to send in the tanks and send in the troops. And then you have the brutal crushing of this uprising, in which thousands of Soviet soldiers will crush and fight against Dubček's civilians.
Never again in the Cold War did either Soviet Union or the United States attempt to interfere in each other's recognized spheres of influence. The Americans, who'd already stood by amid terrible bloodbaths in the Polish shipyards, amid the 1956 Hungarian uprising, 1968, when there was the uprising in Prague, the Prague Spring, that once again the Americans did nothing and the Russians were left free to crush that. Whereas, again, while all that was going on in Vietnam, although of course the Soviet Union provided terrific material aid to Vietnam, at no time did the Soviet Union think of directly intervening in the Vietnam War. So never again was there such a dangerous moment when either side attempted to infringe each other's spheres of influence.
The first 2.5 decades of the Cold War had been filled with revolutionary uprisings and proxy battles all across the globe. But as the 1970s began, a surprising period of détente emerged, where more direct relations between the Western world and the communist world were established.
In China, with Zhou Enlai, President Nixon begins a dialogue which marks an historic change in American policy. A political realist, the president knows that communication with China is indispensable to his grand design, the result of a long, careful planning, of a vision for peace born long ago. The thrust for peace leads to the Soviet Union. The president will not be dissuaded by the days of hard negotiation ahead. The opportunity to reduce world tension is at hand, and he achieves a breakthrough with agreements in environment, space, medicine, and a trade pact creating new jobs for Americans. But most significant of all, a treaty to limit arms.
With the significant decrease in tensions in the Cold War, Leonid Brezhnev focused on the domestic challenges that faced the Soviet Union.
The hallmark, I think, of Brezhnev's economic policies were the 5-year plans. He liked these 5-year plans. In the early 70s saw a big increase in the consumer goods that were being produced by the Soviet Union. Something of an economic miracle took place in these years, and even the West was surprised at how the Soviet economy was performing, but it wouldn't last. The Soviet economy was too reliant on natural resources, on oil, on gas, and the whole thing would begin to stagnate. And we're soon going to enter what Gorbachev would later call the era of stagnation.
So there was certainly stagnation politically in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev. Fewer and fewer freedoms were allowed, writers were censored, people self-censored themselves rather than risk getting into trouble. The economy actually was not so stagnant. It continued to grow. We think of the Brezhnev period as a period where a Soviet consumer public actually came of age. People were aware of fashion and able to choose what they wanted to buy. But overall, there was a sense that it wasn't progressing as fast as it could. And this was reinforced by the stability of the leadership, who were getting older and older and not really allowing any new blood to come in. So there was a sense that the whole thing was grinding to a slow halt.
There were all sorts of holes in the system that made it possible to live under Brezhnev. So although it was stagnation, the country made no big progress in GDP or in facilities, there were loopholes.
And so while the Kremlin looks unchanged, and in the eyes of the world, some people thought the Cold War was going to go on indefinitely. Some people still thought that the Soviet Union might emerge as the economic victor. So self-confidence in the West was not nearly as high as one might expect. And it is quite extraordinary that with all those expensive intelligence services in Britain, in the United States and everywhere else, that the understanding of the fundamental weakness of the Soviet Union, which was getting worse and worse all the time, and that far from the danger to the Western triumph, that the gap between the economic attainments of the West and the Soviet Union is widening relentlessly. And yet none of this was understood in the West at the time.
In 1979, after a long period of détente, tensions in the Cold War suddenly rose once again with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan.
Brezhnev was very worried that the Soviet Union was losing its influence in the countries on the edge of its borders, and one of these was Afghanistan. The communist government of Afghanistan was under withering attack from the Afghan Mujahideen. And so Brezhnev decides to send in Soviet troops and tanks and forces to try and prop up this communist regime.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was part of the Soviet effort to project itself as an alternative to capitalism in the eyes of the Third World. So they were always trying to promote liberation movements, independence movements. 1978, a communist government took power in Afghanistan. There was internal fighting. The first government was overthrown. A second communist government came to power. They appealed to the Soviet Union for help against their enemies. And so the Soviet Union agreed to send in troops to help keep them in power.
The plan was really controlled or proposed by Andropov, who was the head of the KGB and was the most clever and interesting person in the leadership and really the most talented. He believed it could be done easily just by chopping off the head of the leader, who was a communist who'd turned against Brezhnev's, the Kremlin's own candidate, executed him and taken power. They didn't trust this guy, who was called Hafizullah Amin. And so they began to fear that Amin would turn against them and actually embrace the Americans or the Chinese. And so, you know, they decided to replace him. And so in the end, they sent in special forces with an army. What they didn't expect was a massive Islamicist rebellion that would be backed by the Americans.
Many people compare the Soviet engagement in Afghanistan with the United States in Vietnam. They got sucked in without realizing what they were getting into, without an exit strategy. Many young Soviet men died, led rise to a movement among mothers trying to stop men from being drafted. So it severely weakened the government in the eyes of its own population.
Afghanistan was one of the decisive strategic mistakes of the last phase of the Soviet Union before its collapse. And it was the same story as with a lot of American wars, that they got nowhere and they were made fools of by their own clients in Afghanistan, and their casualties were appalling. And the bungling, the military bungling, was fantastic. But the United States could afford its mistakes in the Cold War, and the Soviet Union couldn't. So that you had this extraordinary situation that as this terrible 10-year war went on, and there's this drain of casualties, which was desperately unpopular at home because people saw these body bags coming home and coming home. And as the Americans and the CIA, of course, who were arming the Mujahideen, the resistance movement, that the price that here was the Soviet Union already creaking and groaning and on the edge of an abyss, and you can argue that it was Afghanistan that pushed it over the edge.
That was a major mistake. Russians in the 19th century knew very well, although they took over most of Central Asia and they would have liked to take over British India, that you leave Afghanistan alone. Nobody has ever successfully dealt with Afghanistan since Alexander the Great invaded it. Everyone has had to retreat. Even the Mongols couldn't stick it. The British Army in the 1840s, which just had one blind person staggering out, the rest of the army dead, was an example. And the Russians knew this. And yet, that was a major mistake to think that they could somehow take it over.
3 years into what would be a near decade-long conflict in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union would lose its longtime leader, Leonid Brezhnev.
Brezhnev dies, and he's succeeded by Yuri Andropov, his former head of the KGB, who'd been so ruthless in crushing internal dissent. But Andropov is simply ill-equipped to deal with the financial crises that are facing the Soviet Union.
Brezhnev's successor was Andropov, who he chose himself, but he himself was already too ill from kidney failure to really do the reforms that were necessary now to make industry and the economy work, to rethink the Soviet communist system and to reinvigorate it. And he very quickly deteriorated. His successor should have been Gorbachev, who was the young and intelligent and up-and-coming younger leader, and who was a protege of Andropov. But instead, Chernenko, who once had been an executioner for Stalin, and really was a sort of known as the silent one. He really never said anything. He was just a sort of non-entity. He too was dying. So he came to leadership for a very short period.
And the joke at the time, because both Brezhnev and Chernenko were not really mobile, Brezhnev was seen to be immobile and Chernenko seemed to be moving around. So they said the trouble with Brezhnev was he was running on batteries, but Chernenko had transistors. And could get around. People believed that Chernenko would be giving broadcasts from his office, but it was really a hospital room made up to look like an administrative office.
The manner of the collapse of the Soviet Union was extraordinary in that it's almost as if the physical collapses of successful leaders mirrored the collapse of the whole edifice. And all these very old, charred, discredited men in the Kremlin, one by one, attempting to seize the reins of power and then proving completely unable to exercise them and collapsing and being removed to their tombs. And it was symbolic.
Konstantin Chernenko, who is so old, so infirm and so almost senile that when he gives the eulogy at Andropov's funeral, he can hardly speak the words. It's clear he's not going to last long, and within another year, he's also dead. And this is the moment of change. This is the moment where a younger man, Mikhail Gorbachev, comes to power on a promise to transform the Soviet Union.
Gorbachev was an extraordinary man to have reached the summits of power in the Kremlin, that he was capable of recognizing failure, of recognizing what had gone wrong, of recognizing the need for radical change. Whereas for years, the Soviet Union had been governed by people who were still clinging desperately to the past and struggling at all costs to avoid the humiliation of public defeat.
Gorbachev, of course, it comes from the Russian word gorbate, which means bent. And the Russian proverb is that only the grave will straighten the bent. So people laughed when he came in with a name like that. His idea was that as everyone was being dishonest, and even he couldn't find out the truth, you had to release the journalism, let the newspapers expose things. And he allowed complaints and scandals to be aired in newspapers and then on television and so on. So people found out more about what was actually happening in the country, and the public came round to his side when it became clear that some sort of campaign was being mounted against the corrupt and the rich. And of course what wrecked it was the Chernobyl accident.
On the 26th of April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant went into meltdown and an enormous cloud of radioactive contamination was released.
Well, Chernobyl happened early on in Gorbachev's period of rule and was a key mistake in that period, because when it happened, they reverted to their old habits of secrecy and denial, which led to much greater loss of life and more damage than otherwise would have been necessary, and also created more suspicion toward the Soviet Union among Western Europeans who were disposed to think positively. This was a period of Euro-communism and of Germany's Ostpolitik, trying to make deals with the Soviet Union. And this was kind of a throwback to the bad old days. So it was a domestic disaster, an international disaster in health terms, but also a very bad signal for what the Soviet Union was becoming.
The White House says Mr. Reagan's attempts to discuss the situation with Mr. Gorbachev personally have been ignored by the Kremlin for 4 days.
Not very much.
They're usually a little close-mouthed about these things.
Would you rather hear more from Mr. Gorbachev?
Yes, I think it would be helpful.
Gorbachev had spoken of glasnost. He'd spoken of openness, of a more open media. And the first instinct is to go back to the old Soviet way of doing things, to hide everything, to cover everything up. And this was a disaster because the Western media had already picked up from very early on the increased levels of radiation. They knew something disastrous had happened at this nuclear reactor. But Gorbachev tries to hide it. And this proved the limits of his policy of glasnost.
Gorbachev, in the end, used this to his advantage. To him, it was proof that the old system was so dangerous, you could have made half of Russia uninhabitable. If those reactors had melted into the ground, the Western Ukraine would be strictly for the animals. It proved to the Russian public there was no point having the traditional secrecy, that you had to have openness. And the very fact that foreigners knew about it and Russians heard about it from foreign broadcasts, and then they found out.
In 1985, the final leader of the Soviet Union came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev.
The name Gorbachev is really synonymous with perestroika. This was his great idea. He wanted to reform the system. He wanted to bring an element of the markets into the system. He could see that the Soviet economy was simply not functioning. It was moribund. He was going to revitalize. There was going to be a renaissance to the economy.
I think Gorbachev is misunderstood by everyone. Everyone nowadays thinks that he was, in the West anyway, that he was a sort of anti-communist liberal Democrat, rather like one of our leaders. But in fact, he was very different. He was a Leninist. He believed in communism. He believed in the Soviet Union, and he wanted to reform it, to make it stronger, to make it work better, to make it more formidable. What in fact happened was he had very attractive features in terms of his openness and his smile and his ability to go on walkabouts, and he immediately impressed the Western leaders. But in the Soviet Union himself, he really attempted an insane plethora of reforms that undermined the whole empire. And in some ways, his ambitions were hubristic, if not arrogant. He thought he could do it. He hadn't really thought through the nature of the Soviet Union and the nature of the Leninist system. He tried to reform the economy, the power politics, and ultimately the nature of the Union itself, in other words, the empire, all at the same time. And no one had attempted that before, and with good reason, because each of those reforms was a colossal reform that could have destroyed the Soviet Union on its own.
We can all see today that he was something very remarkable, and he broke with the past. But I remember so well when the first reports of Gorbachev from our correspondents in Moscow, and some imaginative correspondents did see that Gorbachev was something quite new and quite special. I met him, and he was an extraordinary man, and I do hope that history will pay him the tribute that is his due, because he was the one who broke the mold. But for us, who'd lived almost all our lives in the shadow of the Cold War, it was almost impossible to believe that the whole edifice, the whole structure around which we'd lived was suddenly changing, and that the Soviet Union and Russia, as we'd known it, was suddenly tottering. So we were very slow, some of us, and governments, to realize the nature of the change.
Gorbachev wanted an end to the Cold War. He wanted an end to the arms race. But this was very difficult when, during Reagan's first term as President of the United States, Reagan spoke of the evil empire. He was very antagonistic towards the Soviet Union. But this began to change. I think he saw in Mikhail Gorbachev somebody he could do business with. And they eventually sat down and they began to discuss the reduction in weaponry. And I think really it was the personal relationship between these two men, and also with Margaret Thatcher and Gorbachev, that it was a coming together of personalities that enabled the Cold War and the arms race to come to an end.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Not long after Ronald Reagan's famous speech at the Brandenburg Gate, one of the great symbols of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, would finally fall.
The Berlin Wall had been a success in the sense that it stopped East Germany becoming depopulated, but it hadn't made it much more prosperous. I mean, it had a limited prosperity because it produced better goods than any other East European country. But even so, the desire to get across that wall was very, very great. And in fact, when Gorbachev thought about it, he clearly realized there was no enormous advantage to the Soviet Union in having Germany divided. He perhaps made a mistake. He should have insisted that Germany be permanently neutral, never be allowed to join NATO if it was reunited. That would have reassured a lot of people. But it was a way of making Gorbachev extremely popular in Germany. But of course, he didn't realize that he had to be popular at home in Russia. And the problem with Gorbachev is always that he's been adored abroad and loathed at home.
There were people within the party who opposed his reforms. They opposed it because they believed in a different kind of communism, or they opposed it because they were going to lose their positions of privilege. A lot of backsliding and a lot of opposition. So that's when he decided, 1988, to launch democratization, opening up the Communist Party to elections, hoping that a rejuvenated party would decisively defeat the old guard and provide support within the party for his policies of reform. And so, starting in 1988, there were elections for party committees. And people started to join the party in droves because suddenly the party was becoming very interesting. There, important things were being discussed. They were being discussed openly. So there was a real ferment, 1988, 1989, as a result of his democratization.
But unfortunately, it awakened sentiments in Eastern Europe that suddenly the countries of Eastern Europe, particularly East Germany, Poland, Hungary, they sniffed at freedom here. And we began to get unrest, protests against the Soviet Union. And this began in Poland, where we have the first semi-free elections, and we have solidarity under the charismatic leadership of Lech Walesa with his walrus moustache, storming to victory in this election. This is a huge shock for not just for Poland and the Soviet Union, but for the whole of Eastern Europe. Suddenly, a whole new way of doing things becomes apparent. We see the first cracks in the entire Soviet system.
1989 proved to be the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. Its forces finally left Afghanistan, and political uprisings could not be stopped either among the Warsaw Pact countries or within the Soviet Union itself.
The economy completely failed. Gorbachev and the Communist Party lost all authority, and the 15 republics, particularly those that had joined the Soviet Union very late, particularly the Baltic republics, the three Baltics, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, pushed for freedom and for the breakup of the Soviet Union. And in August of '91, there was an attempted coup by effectively by his own government, from which he was only rescued by Yeltsin. And that was really the death knell of the Soviet Union and of Gorbachev.
If you go back to its beginnings, the hopeful replacement of an autocratic czar with a democratic socialist republic, and it failed to do that. The question is, did it fail because a socialist economy was inherently incapable of providing prosperity and development for the people, or was it badly run? Did it descend into corruption? It was a strong military force. It was decisive in defeating Hitler. And I think that's today one of the enduring sources of pride for Russians in the Russian Federation, is the victory that they had over Hitler. And that happened because of the strong support of the people. But it was also known for its repression, for the numbers of victims, for its inhumanity, and the tremendous costs of this experiment.
The final dissolution of the Soviet Union happened in a forest hunting lodge on the Polish border, with a lot of vodka consumed, that they recognized it couldn't go on, that they might as well split up and try and remain friends, and then go back to Moscow and announce that the Soviet Union no longer existed.
Gorbachev resigned himself to the fact that the Soviet Union was finished. It was no more. On the 25th of December 1991, he resigns as Soviet president and as commander-in-chief. On the following day, the Supreme Soviet vote the Soviet Union out of existence. It will stagger on for a couple more days, but it comes to an end on the 31st of December 1991. The USSR is no more.
It broke apart into its constituent parts. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia had already voted for independence. Georgia became independent. All the 15 Union republics that had been part of the Union all went their separate ways as independent republics. The Central Asian republics probably didn't really want to be independent, but they really had no alternative because there was no Soviet Union.
And so all the parts of the machine, if you like, fell to pieces at the same time, simultaneously. And Russia emerged as an independent republic, as did the other 15 republics, the constituent republics of the Soviet Union, which Lenin and Stalin had designed never to become independent, never to secede. Well, now they all became independent at the same time, and the Soviet Union was no more.